Today's lesson, the professor began, his voice echoing slightly in the grand hall, is one of history's most infamous misunderstandings. But before we dive into the how, we must first address the why. The students hushed, leaning in with curiosity. A few tentacled creatures near the front clicked their mandibles in anticipation, while a reptilian figure in the back flicked its tongue out, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Now, not all humans are the same, the professor said, pacing slowly with his hands clasped behind his back. This isn't due to genetics, but culture. A few tentacles wriggled, confused by the idea. On their worlds, cultural distinctions often translated into genetic divergences, but humans, ever the anomaly in the galaxy, did things their own way. You see, humans have a variety of cultures that can make them act very differently, he emphasized, turning to face the crowd. One such culture, Russians, were the first humans to reach space, and trust me when I say, they never quite let that go. A few creatures blinked, or the equivalent thereof, waiting for the explanation. The professor smiled, an expression that contained more than a hint of mischief. Most people of Russian descent are perfectly normal, just like any other human you'd encounter on Earth or its many colonies. They live peacefully, drink their vodka, he said, pronouncing the word with a slightly exaggerated Russian accent, causing a few chuckles from the back row. But there is that one colony, founded before Earth unified under a single government, where the story took an interesting turn. He paused for effect, letting the tension build. The Russians, you see, founded a colony long before Earth became the peaceful, pacifist utopia it is now. And while that colony managed to maintain its independence for quite some time, it also managed to get itself involved in a little, shall we say, galactic situation. More murmurs. The creatures' minds churned, trying to grasp the concept. After all, they knew humans were now among the most feared species in the galaxy. Not because of brute strength, but because of their frightening unpredictability. The Russians, for instance, the professor continued, while technically the first humans in space, could never quite let that go. Imagine this. Hundreds of years after they left Earth, every single Russian descendant on that colony still considered themselves the peak of human achievement, as if they were the ones carrying humanity forward into the stars. A few students exchanged skeptical glances. One small, fur-covered being, sitting near the edge of the row, raised a hand, or what passed for a hand, with 4 digits and a thumb on the opposite side. "But, Professor?" The student asked in a voice that was both melodic and chirpy. Why would they think that? Surely they were aware Earth was progressing as well. The professor smiled, pleased with the interruption. Ah, that's the beauty of it. You see, the colony was founded before Earth's unification. The Russians there had no contact with the outside world. They knew little of Earth's development, so they carried on with their own version of history. He stepped closer to the holographic board behind him, tapping a few buttons to display an image of the planet. And let me tell you, he said, his voice lowering conspiratorially, they were nothing short of dedicated to their interpretation of Russian greatness. They held onto it like a lifeline, passed it down through the generations, exaggerating their role in everything. They were still talking about the space race as if it had happened last week. A snort of laughter escaped a student in the back, earning them a stern glance from the professor. Oh, laugh now, the professor said, wagging a finger. But this one colony, made things very interesting for the whole galaxy, especially for themselves. He clicked a button and a new image appeared, a grainy old photo of a rocket launch from the early space era. Picture this, he said, gesturing to the image, a colony of humans who still brag about this. Their children grow up hearing stories of how Russia single-handedly conquered space, how they were the true pioneers of interstellar travel, and how their bravery and innovation would lead humanity to dominate the stars. Another click. The next image showed a group of heavily armed humans, their faces red from both the cold and an excessive amount of alcohol, gathered around a table stacked with bottles of vodka. Their expressions were a mix of determination and utter confusion, as though they had no idea why they were there, but by the gods, they were ready for whatever was coming next. Now, most Russian-descended humans are perfectly normal, the professor repeated, whether they live on Earth or in one of its many colonies. But this one colony, well, they had a different approach to galactic diplomacy. The professor couldn't suppress a grin as he clicked the board again, and an animated recreation of the colony's first contact with alien life appeared. The scene depicted a small, green-skinned alien ambassador stepping off their craft, ready to greet what they assumed would be fellow galactic diplomats. Instead, they were met with a band of heavily armed, slightly drunk Russians, one of whom immediately offered the alien a bottle of vodka. The students burst into laughter, and the professor paused, letting the absurdity of the scene sink in. Yes, the professor said, they didn't quite understand the nuances of interspecies diplomacy, but in their defense, they were very hospitable. He walked back to the center of the stage, his face still wearing that amused expression. And yet, it was their, shall we say, unique interpretation of galactic relations that eventually dragged them, and the rest of us, into one of the most ridiculous galactic wars in history. He paused, savoring the suspense. The students leaned in, eager for the details. They caused quite the stir, especially because of their communication style, or lack thereof, and when Earth finally got reintegrated with them, well, things really went sideways. He let out a sigh that was half laughter, half exasperation, but you'll have to wait for that part. Before we get into the chaos, we need to go back to where it all started. Another student raised what appeared to be a hand, though it had too many joints to be truly human-like. But why did they think they were so special? The student asked, puzzled. The professor shrugged theatrically. Because in their minds, they were special. You see, the Russians were convinced that they were the greatest humans who ever lived. The colony's records, heavily edited and passed down through generations, turned their early space ventures into the stuff of legend. To them, everything was a Russian victory. No challenge was too big, no defeat was acknowledged. Every setback, just another chapter in their inevitable success. He clicked again, showing a diagram of a Russian colony spacecraft, ramshackle and somehow still functional, despite being centuries old. They prided themselves on their resilience, their strength, and their inability to lose. In fact, in their minds, they'd never lost a single war. But only in their minds, since history records them as pretty much losing most conflicts since what humans call World War I. And even when they were victorious, they actually won because of others' help. He looked out at the class, eyebrows raised. And that belief, that unshakable, vodka-fueled confidence, is what made things very interesting for the entire galaxy. The Galactic Council Chamber was a majestic sight, if your idea of majesty involved hundreds of different species nervously eyeing each other while pretending not to smell the various pungent odors of their fellow delegates. The grand hall buzzed with tense conversation, the galaxy on the brink of the largest war it had ever seen. Massive screens blinked with tactical maps, while holograms projected the ever-growing threat from the approaching enemy fleet. The Exratil Dominion. The Exratil were not just any enemy. They were ruthless, efficient, and entirely uninterested in peaceful resolutions. The Dominion had already wiped out 3 star systems without breaking a sweat, and their next target was the core of galactic civilization. For once, all the alien species had agreed on something. They needed a miracle, and they needed it fast. That's where the humans came in. Has anyone contacted the humans yet? A spindly, insect-like creature chittered nervously from its seat, its multiple arms twitching. We need their weapons. There was a murmur of agreement across the council. Everyone had heard of humanity's legendary destructive capabilities. They had been quiet for centuries, but their reputation lived on, violent, unpredictable, and capable of building weapons that could reduce entire star systems to rubble with the press of a button. They're the only ones with the tech to stop the Exratil, muttered an enormous bear-like delegate, shaking its shaggy head. We can't face the Dominion without their help. We'll all be dead within the week if they don't step in. The room fell silent as the council's communication officer, a small, blue-skinned creature with too many eyes and not enough confidence, shuffled to the front. Well, you see, we, did contact Earth. Everyone leaned in, waiting for the glorious news that humanity was about to unleash their devastating arsenal in the galaxy's defense. And, a voice demanded from the back. The officer fidgeted, its numerous eyes blinking rapidly. They said no. The chamber erupted into chaos. What do you mean no? We're all going to die. The communication officer held up a hand, or something that vaguely resembled a hand. Please, I'm just the messenger. Earth has, changed a bit since the last time we contacted them. Apparently, they've become some sort of pacifist utopia. More shocked gasps rippled through the room. Pacifists? Humans? That doesn't even make sense, barked a large reptilian general, his tail thrashing in disbelief. Are we talking about the same species? The ones who invented a bomb that could destroy a planet by accident? The communication officer nodded miserably. Yes, they, said they no longer believe in violence and have renounced all forms of warfare. They can't do that, shouted a slug-like delegate, her slimy body jiggling with outrage. We're in the middle of a galactic crisis. We need their weapons. I tried to explain that to them, the officer said weakly, but they were very firm on the whole no war, no weapons thing. The council chamber descended into despair, with various species communicating their frustration in ways that ranged from loud growling to a chorus of mournful chirps. Finally, one of the elder members of the council, an ancient, tree-like being whose branches creaked as it moved, raised a question that cut through the noise. What about the other humans? The chamber grew quiet as everyone tried to figure out what that meant. What other humans? Asked the same reptilian general, still glaring at the communication officer, as if this were all somehow his fault. The colony, the tree-like elder rasped. The human colony that splintered from Earth long before they unified. It was Russian, I believe? The bear-like delegate perked up, his ears twitching. Russia? That's the one, isn't it? The humans who were first in space. Their descendants must still carry the warrior spirit. They haven't been in contact with Earth for centuries, so maybe, just maybe, they haven't gone soft like the rest of their species. A murmur of agreement spread across the council. The communication officer, now pale or bluer, depending on how one interpreted his skin color, cleared his throat. We could reach out to them, I suppose. But the records we have of that colony are patchy at best. They broke off contact a long time ago and, well, no one's really sure what's been going on over there. Perfect, the bear-like delegate growled. If they haven't been corrupted by Earth's new pacifist ideals, then they'll be the warriors we need. Send them a message immediately. The communication officer looked uncertain. And what do I say? Tell them the galaxy is in danger, the reptilian general roared. Tell them their warrior legacy is needed once again. Play into their pride. I'm sure the Russians will leap at the chance to prove themselves. The council members nodded in agreement. The idea of reaching out to a human colony, one that still potentially held on to the fierce warrior ways of their ancestors, was the best chance they had left. The communication officer turned, tapping frantically at the console in front of him. Okay. Sending message to... What is this planet's name again? Ah, there we go, Nova Russ. I'm sure they'll respond soon. Meanwhile, on Nova Russ, things were not quite what the Galactic Council had in mind. The planet's capital, Krasnygorod, was bustling in its usual chaotic way. Buildings that looked like they'd been designed by someone with only a vague understanding of architecture stood proudly, despite clearly leaning at dangerous angles. The streets were packed with people, and by people, one meant very drunk Russians. It was a day like any other, celebratory. Not for any particular reason, just the kind of day where everyone felt like celebrating. Because why not? Inside the towering, crooked structure known as the New Kremlin, the president of Nova Russ, Viktor Iron Liver Ivanov, was deep in thought, or as deep as a man could be while nursing his fourth bottle of vodka that afternoon. His thoughts were interrupted when his comms officer, a stout man with a perpetual look of mild confusion, stumbled into the room. Comrade President, the man slurred slightly, still recovering from the morning's rounds of celebratory drinks. We've received a message from space. Ivanov blinked, the vodka haze in his mind momentarily lifting. From space? Like aliens? The comms officer nodded. Yes, something about a war. They want us to fight. Ivanov burst into laughter, clutching his sides. Fight? They want us to fight? Do they not know we haven't had a decent fight in years? The comms officer scratched his head. They think we're the greatest warriors of humanity or something. I'm not sure how they got that idea. Ivanov's laughter died down, replaced by a glimmer of something in his eyes. Pride. The Russians were, after all, the first in space. They had a legacy to uphold, didn't they? He stood up, albeit a little wobbly. Well then, comrade, if the galaxy wants our help, who are we to deny them? We'll show them what real Russians can do. The comms officer frowned. But we don't actually have, weapons. Not modern ones anyway, just the old stuff. Ivanov waved a hand dismissively. Details. We'll improvise. Russians are great at improvising. How do you think we've survived all these years out here? Send them a message, tell them we accept, and open another bottle of vodka. We're going to need to celebrate. As the comms officer hurried off to send the response, Ivanov sat back down, grinning from ear to ear. Warriors of humanity, huh? He liked the sound of that. After all, they were Russian. They hadn't lost a war in, a long time. Even if they hadn't fought in one in equally long. He stood up again, raising his half-empty bottle to no one in particular. To Nova Rus, to victory, and to whatever comes next. Back at the Galactic Council, the communication officer checked the incoming response, his multiple eyes blinking in disbelief. They said yes, he stammered, his voice cracking. They're going to fight. The council erupted in cheers. Finally, their saviors had arrived. They're sending their best warriors, the communication officer continued, his voice growing more confident. The greatest human fighters in the galaxy, apparently. The reptilian general slapped his tail on the ground in approval. See? I told you. The Russians. They'll save us all. The communication officer, relieved to be delivering good news for once, smiled and sent the final confirmation. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to witness the might of Nova Rus. On the far-off planet of Nova Rus, nestled deep in the reaches of the galaxy, where nobody really bothered to keep track of galactic affairs, the sun was setting over the capital city of Krasny Gorod. Not that anyone cared. Day and night were relative concepts on Nova Rus, because it was always a good time to celebrate something, even if no one could remember exactly what that something was. Today was one of those days. The streets were alive with chaos. People staggered through the alleyways, swaying in groups, arms around each other, bellowing half-forgotten patriotic songs from old Earth in slurred voices. Smoke and laughter filled the air as street vendors sold questionable food and even more questionable bottles of homemade vodka. The buildings, towering and crooked, as if designed by someone with a severe inner ear problem, somehow managed to stay standing despite centuries of neglect. Inside the new Kremlin, a vast, half-finished building that leaned dangerously to the left, the atmosphere was no less chaotic. The Great Hall, where the planet's president usually conducted important meetings, was currently the site of what could only be described as a massive drinking party. Bottles of vodka were passed around like candy, and the crowd, dressed in everything from military uniforms to fur hats, was completely hammered. At the center of it all sat President Viktor Iron Liver Ivanov, a man whose reputation for drinking surpassed even his political status. He was holding court at a long table piled high with empty bottles, regaling his fellow Russians with tales of their colony's glorious, completely fictional history. And let me tell you, Ivanov roared, slamming his glass down on the table with a thunderous clunk. When we, the great Russian people, first reached space, the rest of the galaxy trembled. Trembled, I tell you. A cheer erupted from the crowd, and another round of vodka was poured. No one questioned the accuracy of Ivanov's stories. No one was sober enough to care. In fact, no one on Nova Rus was exactly sure when the colony had been founded or what their ancestors had actually achieved. But that didn't stop the legends from growing grander with each retelling. We conquered space, Ivanov continued, his face red from the alcohol and excitement. And if we wanted to, we could do it again tomorrow, but we don't need to. He waved his hand dismissively, nearly knocking over a bottle. Because we've already won. Russia has never lost a war, and we never will. The crowd cheered again, raising their glasses in a drunken salute. Amidst this revelry, no one noticed the arrival of an alien delegation, their ship landing quietly in the outskirts of the city. The aliens sent by the Galactic Council had come to ask for help in the war against the Xexratil Dominion. They had heard tales of Russia's mighty warriors and sought the colony's aid, believing them to be humanity's finest fighting force. The delegation was composed of three species: a tall, insectoid diplomat with a shiny carapace, a squat, fur-covered creature who looked perpetually confused, and a sentient gas cloud floating in a containment suit. As they disembarked from their sleek diplomatic shuttle, the trio exchanged nervous glances, or in the gas cloud's case, nervous gaseous vibrations. Are we sure this is the right place? The insectoid diplomat clicked, looking around at the ramshackle city. This doesn't seem like a military base. The furry one sniffed the air, wrinkling its snout. It smells strange here. The gas cloud made a sound like an anxious hiss, the galactic equivalent of, I have a bad feeling about this. Nevertheless, they pressed on, following the loud sounds of celebration echoing through the streets until they reached the new Kremlin. The doors were wide open, and inside, the scene was one of pure chaos. Hundreds of drunk Russians staggered about, shouting, singing, and occasionally falling over. The insectoid diplomat hesitated. Are these the warriors we've heard so much about? They cautiously entered the Great Hall, where President Ivanov was in the middle of another grandiose declaration. Russia, he shouted, throwing his arms wide, his vodka glass sloshing over the edge. Invincible, unstoppable, and also, he squinted, trying to remember the next word. Also, very drunk. The aliens exchanged uneasy glances. Was this the legendary human ferocity they'd been told about? Clearing his throat, or at least attempting to make a sound that passed for throat clearing, the insectoid diplomat approached the table. Honored President Ivanov, he began in a voice that clicked like a typewriter. We come in peace, but we also come with a request. Ivanov looked up, squinting at the insectoid diplomat, as if trying to decide whether he was real or a particularly intense hallucination. Request? Ivanov slurred. What request? The alien diplomat's antennae twitched nervously. We seek the aid of your esteemed warriors in the coming war against the Extratil Dominion. The galaxy is in peril, and we believe that your people are the only ones who can help us turn the tide. Ivanov blinked. Then he blinked again, slower this time, as if his brain was lagging behind. Warriors, eh? He said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Well, you've come to the right place. The greatest warriors in the galaxy are sitting right here. He waved his arm in a sweeping gesture that almost knocked over the entire table. The crowd cheered again, apparently unaware of what they were cheering for. The alien diplomat, taking this as a sign of agreement, pressed on. We have heard stories of your military prowess. The galaxy knows of your victories, your conquest of space, your unbeatable reputation. We need your help. Ivanov, feeling the warm, fuzzy glow of both alcohol and flattery, leaned forward, grinning like a man who had just won an argument with himself. You're damn right you need our help. Russia has never lost a war, not once. He stood up, swaying slightly, but managing to stay upright, at least for the moment. We conquered space before any of you aliens even knew what space was, and we'd still be out there, kicking ass if we cared to try. One of the aliens, the furry one, nodded eagerly. Yes, this is exactly what we need. Your confidence is inspiring. Ivanov puffed up, clearly pleased with himself. Inspiring? Ha! We're not just inspiring. We're undefeated. If you want Russians to fight in your little war, you've got them. We'll crush these. What were they called? The Extratil Dominion, the insectoid diplomat supplied helpfully. Right, the Extratil, Ivanov shouted. We'll crush them He trailed off, his mind fumbling for the right analogy, then gave up and took another swig of vodka. Like something. The alien diplomats exchanged excited looks. This was going far better than they'd hoped. Just then, Ivanov, already wobbly from alcohol, gestured too wildly with his hand, sending his half-full vodka glass flying. It landed directly on the foot of the insectoid diplomat, drenching him in strong-smelling alcohol. The alien froze, staring at the liquid dripping from his shiny carapace. Ivanov stared at the alien's foot for a long, quiet moment. Then he burst into laughter, a loud, raucous sound that filled the room. Oh man, I got your foot, he howled, clutching his stomach. Apologies, comrade. In Russia, we consider that good luck. The alien blinked, unsure how to respond, but he nodded stiffly, doing his best to smile with mandibles. Ivanov clapped the alien on the shoulder, nearly knocking him over. Don't worry, we'll join your war. Russia is always ready for a fight. Just, remind me what we're fighting again? The insectoid diplomat, unsure whether or not to mention that Ivanov had already asked this question, said, "The Xratil Dominion. They've already destroyed several star systems." Ivanov waved his hand dismissively. "Bah! Star systems! Small potatoes! We'll handle it. Tell the galaxy that Russia is back in the game." The alien diplomats, delighted by this unexpected success, quickly bowed and excused themselves before anyone could change their minds. As they left, Ivanov collapsed back into his chair, his grin still plastered across his face. "Greatest warriors in the galaxy," he muttered to himself, chuckling. "They have no idea what they've just signed up for." He reached for another bottle of vodka, pausing only for a second. Wait, what did we just sign up for? The war began just like most things on Nova Rus, in a haze of alcohol and confusion. After President Ivanov's bold and very drunken promise to join the Galactic Council's war effort, things escalated quickly and chaotically. The Russians, as one might expect, didn't have much in the way of a standing army. But what they did have was a collection of ancient ships, all held together by spit, vodka fumes, and what they referred to as good old-fashioned Russian engineering, which was to say, barely functioning at best. No one was quite sure when these ships had last been flown, or if they could still fly at all, but that didn't stop them. They were Russians. If it was broken, they'd either drink until it fixed itself, or pretend it worked long enough to make it someone else's problem. The first official Russian fleet was cobbled together from whatever vessels could be scrounged up. There were rusty freighters, a few derelict battlecruisers that hadn't seen action since before Earth's unification, and even an old science vessel that had been converted into a makeshift battleship with what seemed to be duct tape and optimism. It was a ragtag assortment of ships crewed by equally ragtag Russians who had no idea what they were getting themselves into. Their first mission: join the Galactic Council's grand assault on the Xratil stronghold. It was a coordinated, carefully planned strike, one that required precision, timing, and clear communication. The Russians, however, were running late. "Where the hell is the fleet?" bellowed Commander Ivanov, no relation to the president, though everyone on Nova Rus was either an Ivanov, a Petrov, or a Sergei. He stared at the star map in front of him, squinting through the haze of vodka. "We should have been there hours ago." Coordinates are garbled," his navigation officer slurred, tapping his console in a vain attempt to make the data clearer. "Looks like we, might be in the wrong system." Commander Ivanov's face turned red. "Wrong system? What do you mean, wrong system?" The comms officer, equally drunk and equally confused, chimed in. "I'm picking up some chatter, sir. I think we're interrupting a diplomatic banquet." "A banquet?" Ivanov blinked, looking at the screen. Sure enough, their fleet had dropped out of hyperspace into what appeared to be a peaceful alien gathering. Hundreds of dignitaries from various species were enjoying what looked like a luxurious banquet on a massive diplomatic space station. The Russians' sudden appearance, with their cobbled-together fleet, had caused a stir. Several dignitaries were frozen, forks halfway to their mouths, staring at the ragtag group of ships that had just materialized in their midst. "Shit!" Ivanov muttered, scratching his head. "What do we do?" "We retreat?" offered the navigation officer, already flipping switches to get the fleet back into hyperspace. "Before they realize we're not supposed to be here?" "Good idea," Ivanov nodded. "Let's get out of here before anyone asks questions." But the retreat wasn't as clean as they'd hoped. As the ships scrambled to turn around, several of them collided with one another, an inevitable outcome when half the crew had consumed more vodka than water in the past 48 hours. One particularly large ship scraped along the side of the space station, sending a shower of debris floating into space. Another ship accidentally fired its landing thrusters in the wrong direction, launching a cargo container directly through the banquet hall window. Pandemonium ensued. The alien dignitaries screamed and scattered as chunks of metal crashed into their tables. The Russian fleet, realizing they had very much overstayed their welcome, made a hasty retreat, leaving a trail of debris, confusion, and panic in their wake. Back at the Galactic Council's war room, the Xratil fleet commanders watched the footage in stunned silence. The Russians had just barged into the middle of a high-level diplomatic banquet, caused absolute chaos, and retreated without firing a single shot. The Exratil commanders exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't even engage, one of them muttered, running the footage back to analyze the carnage. They just left. But look at the aftermath. Another Exratil officer pointed to the wreckage floating in space. They didn't need to engage directly. They've destabilized the entire diplomatic effort. Look at the panic. We can't even get these species to agree on lunch now, let alone military coordination. The lead Stratil commander squinted at the footage, watching the Russians' disastrous retreat frame by frame. This is advanced psychological warfare. They've created chaos without firing a shot. They're unpredictable, erratic, and that's the most dangerous kind of enemy. The Stratil officers murmured in agreement. If the Russians were capable of this much damage just by showing up, what could they do if they actually tried? Meanwhile, back on Earth, things were about to take a sharp turn for the worse. The Galactic Council, thoroughly confused by the Russians' strange tactics, accidentally transmitted garbled coordinates for their next battle. Somehow, those coordinates ended up pointing toward Earth. And somehow, an overzealous Exratil fleet misinterpreted this as an order to launch a surprise strike on the humans' home planet. The Shretil fleet emerged from hyperspace above Earth with little warning, immediately bombarding several major cities before anyone on the ground even knew what was happening. Millions of civilians were killed in the first few hours. The pacifist Earth government, which had sworn off war and violence, suddenly found itself facing an enemy that didn't care about peace treaties. For the first time in centuries, Earth retaliated. No one really knew what Earth had been working on during their centuries of supposed pacifism, but it quickly became clear that they hadn't been idle. Earth's response was swift, brutal, and terrifying. Massive space-based weapons platforms that had been hidden for generations were activated, their immense cannons locking onto the Exratil fleet. The first shot alone obliterated an entire Exratil battalion, reducing their ships to cosmic dust. The second shot tore through their command ship, leaving nothing but a gaping hole where it had once been. The Exratil fleet, completely unprepared for such overwhelming force, scrambled to retreat, but there was no escaping the barrage of hyper-advanced weaponry that Earth unleashed. In less than an hour, the entire Evertil fleet was gone, annihilated without a single Earth ship leaving orbit. The few survivors who managed to escape fled back to their commanders, shell-shocked and babbling about the unstoppable human defenses. Back at the Galactic Council, the Exratil commanders received the news with stunned disbelief. How did they do this? One commander stammered. Their pacifism was supposed to make them weak. The lead commander shook his head, reviewing the tactical data. They must have been preparing for this all along. We underestimated their capabilities. But this wasn't Earth, the second-in-command pointed out, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The Russians were the ones responsible for the confusion at the banquet. They've been playing a much deeper game than we thought. This was all part of their plan. The lead commander nodded gravely. Of course, the Russians set the stage, and Earth delivered the final blow. This was their strategy from the start. Word of the devastating defeat spread quickly throughout the Galactic Council. As far as anyone could tell, the Russians had orchestrated the entire chain of events. They had sown chaos among the Council's ranks, disrupted diplomatic efforts, and ultimately baited the Exratil into attacking Earth, where they were destroyed in a show of unprecedented firepower. The fact that the Russians had stumbled into most of this by accident was, of course, lost in the retelling. On Nova Rus, the mood was celebratory, though to be fair, every mood was celebratory on Nova Rus. The news of the Exratil fleet's destruction had reached the colony, and the Russians were taking full credit for it. They didn't know exactly how they'd done it, but they were convinced it had been part of some grand, unspoken plan that only they were clever enough to understand. President Ivanov, now fully embracing his role as the greatest military strategist in the galaxy, stood on a balcony overlooking the capital, a bottle of vodka in one hand and a megaphone in the other. "Comrades," he shouted to the gathered crowd below. "Once again, we have proven that Russia never loses a war, not even when we don't know we're fighting one." The crowd roared in approval, waving their bottles in the air. Ivanov grinned, taking a long swig from his bottle. "This is only the beginning, my friends. Soon, The entire galaxy will know the strength of Nova Russ. We will, he hiccuped, nearly dropping the megaphone. We will continue to be the greatest. Behind him, his advisors exchanged worried glances. Do you think they'll actually expect us to keep fighting now? One of them asked nervously. Ivanov waved him off. Nah, don't worry about it. We've already won. What could possibly go wrong? The Earth government's central diplomatic hub hummed with activity, a sleek, pristine monument to bureaucracy in all its shining glory. Ministers and diplomats milled about, exchanging small talk while sipping environmentally friendly, ethically sourced coffee. Peaceful murals of lush green fields adorned the walls, and holograms of doves floated gently in the background. Earth, the jewel of pacifism in the galaxy, had become accustomed to diplomatic pleasantries and soft-spoken negotiations. So when the strange messages began flooding in from various alien species, no one quite knew how to handle it. The first message arrived from a particularly aggressive-looking race called the G-Loraxians, whose traditional garb seemed to be made out of the skulls of various unfortunate creatures. Their message, which arrived in the middle of Earth's weekly Intergalactic Friendliness Day, was full of what appeared to be enthusiastic praise for humanity's tactical brilliance and unmatched military might. It ended with a desperate plea for peace and an offer to surrender unconditionally. Earth's senior diplomat, Laura Winters, blinked at the screen in utter confusion. She adjusted her glasses and read it again, just to be sure. Does anyone know what they're talking about? She asked, looking around the room. A few aides shrugged, some shook their heads, but most were busy fidgeting with their tablets, trying to find some context. Winters frowned. Unmatched military might? Tactical brilliance? This has to be a mistake. We haven't fired a shot in centuries. I think it's a prank, suggested one of the junior aides, snickering. Maybe some aliens think it's funny to mess with us peace-loving types. But more messages poured in. The peaceful Alarons, usually known for their meditation retreats and self-help guides, sent a panicked communique offering generous peace terms and free access to their most sacred star temples. The fact that they offered this alongside detailed descriptions of how they would happily disarm their orbital defense systems was alarming, to say the least. What are we supposed to do with this? Winters muttered, pacing in front of the holographic display. Another aide waved his hand. Maybe it's some kind of intergalactic spam, like a phishing scam. Phishing scam? Winters shot him an incredulous look. What are they phishing for? Our stockpile of meditation apps? Despite the confusion, protocol demanded a response. Diplomacy couldn't wait for things like understanding. Winters sighed and opened her notes. All right, let's start with a basic response. Something neutral and diplomatic. How about we thank them for their generous offer and suggest a peaceful trade agreement? That sounds appropriately vague, said another aide. Winters nodded. Send it. Several hours later, when the Giloraxians received Earth's offer for a peaceful trade agreement, they were utterly bewildered. Trade agreement? Did the humans not understand that they had been surrendering? The Giloraxian warlords, now unsure of whether the humans were mocking them or simply toying with their minds, decided to halt all battle preparations until they could figure out how to negotiate with these. Confusing Earthlings. Meanwhile, on Earth, the odd messages kept coming. One from the Brontha, a militaristic race known for their brutal gladiatorial arenas, arrived next. They, too, showered Earth with effusive compliments, calling them masters of the battlefield and supreme overlords of strategy, begging for terms that might spare them from humanity's apparent wrath. Winters stared at the message with a mixture of confusion and dread. Supreme overlords of strategy? That sounds like the title of a bad action movie from the 90s, she groaned, rubbing her temples. This is getting out of hand, one of the aides whispered. Winters waved her hand. Let's just offer them a diplomatic summit. We'll set up a meeting, maybe clear up whatever this misunderstanding is. 2 days later, the summit was set. The humans sent a delegation to what they believed was the designated diplomatic site, a peaceful moon in neutral territory. They arrived with flowers, goodwill gestures, and a basket of gluten-free, ethically sourced pastries. The Brontha delegation, however, arrived armed to the teeth, battle-scarred, and ready for what they believed would be the final confrontation. They had misinterpreted the invitation as a last stand, a chance for humanity to seal the deal with the most intense battle yet. The Brontha warriors prepared themselves mentally for glorious combat, their weapons gleaming under the artificial lights of the conference room. What they found was a table draped with a flowery tablecloth and an assortment of baked goods. The human delegation, blissfully unaware of the tension, welcomed the Brontha with wide smiles and handshakes. "Ah, thank you for coming," Winters said warmly, offering one of the Brontha generals a scone. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. We're here to discuss peace." The Brontha general blinked, his massive hand hovering uncertainly over the scone. He looked around, utterly perplexed. Where were the weapons? The tactical maps? The death stares of enemies locked in a life-or-death struggle? "Peace?" he repeated, his voice booming. "Yes, of course," Winters replied cheerfully. "We're so glad you're interested in negotiating peace." The general, still holding the scone, stared down at it as if it were some kind of alien weapon. "This is how you wage war? Wage war?" Winters laughed nervously, thinking the Brontha had made some sort of joke. "Oh, no, we don't believe in war. We're pacifists." The Brontha warriors exchanged uneasy glances. This had to be part of some elaborate strategy, they thought. Surely, the humans were playing some kind of mind game. This was psychological warfare at its finest. In the end, the summit concluded with the Brontha hurriedly agreeing to whatever terms Earth proposed, convinced that the humans were so far beyond their understanding that it was safer to just go along with whatever was happening. They left, muttering in awe about the humans' terrifying ability to wage war without even acknowledging it was happening. Back on Earth, however, things were only getting weirder. Alien nations kept requesting summits at sites of confrontation, a phrase Earth interpreted as a request for peaceful talks. One summit was scheduled in the Gamma 7 Nebula, which, unknown to the humans, was the staging ground for an upcoming battle between two warring species. When the humans arrived, armed only with flowers and pastries once again, they found themselves in the middle of an all-out firefight. "Oh dear," Winters murmured as lasers shot past her head. Are we under attack?" One of the aides squeaked, ducking behind a decorative potted plant. No, Winters waved a hand, maintaining her diplomatic cool. "It's probably just a misunderstanding. We're here for peace talks. Let's stay calm." The humans, of course, remained calm as ever. Their refusal to react to the chaos was seen by the combatants as further proof of humanity's unparalleled strategic prowess. How could these Earthlings remain so serene in the midst of such carnage? It was terrifying. The warring factions quickly called a ceasefire, assuming that Earth's very presence meant something far more significant than anyone could comprehend. The humans had once again won, though they had absolutely no idea what was going on. By the time Winters and her team returned to Earth, they were more confused than ever. "Why does everyone think we're these strategic masterminds?" one of the junior aides asked, scratching his head. "We haven't even fired a shot." Winters sighed, staring at yet another congratulatory message from a distant star system. "I don't know," she muttered, glancing at the massive stack of unopened messages. "But whatever it is, we're doing it really well." At the Earth Central Diplomatic Hub, things had settled into a bizarre routine of confusion and miscommunication. Diplomats were getting used to receiving strange messages from terrified alien species begging for peace or surrendering in situations where Earth had no idea what they were even talking about. Laura Winters, Earth's senior diplomat, was sitting at her desk when another notification popped up on her screen. She sipped her coffee, squinting at the strange characters that filled the message. Someone want to take a look at this?" she called out. Her assistant, James, wheeled over and peered at the screen. The message was filled with what looked like random symbols and letters mashed together in some alien gibberish that Earth's translation matrix couldn't process. The header was particularly eye-catching. Ultimatum at Первой галактической коалиции. Looks like gibberish to me, James said, tapping the screen. Probably some kind of error in the translation matrix. Or it's spam. You know how these things go. Winters sighed. "I swear, half the messages we get these days are either panic-ridden peace treaties or some intergalactic version of spam." James shrugged. "Do you want me to flag it as spam and delete it?" Winters hesitated for a moment, looking at the message again. Yeah, go ahead. We don't have time for this nonsense. James clicked a button, and the message vanished into the digital void, never to be seen again. Little did they know, they had just deleted one of the most critical communications in recent interstellar history, a peace accord from the alien coalition, written entirely in Russian. On the other side of the galaxy, panic was brewing among the alien coalition's leaders. They had spent days crafting the perfect peace accord, written in what they believed was the only human language that could appeal to the most terrifying faction of humanity, the Russians. They'd done their homework, believing that the Russian language was still the language of military strategy and power. And yet, the message had been met with complete and total silence. The aliens were dumbfounded. They assumed the Russians had received their peace offer, read it, and then, chillingly, ignored it. That could only mean one thing. The Russians were planning an even larger, more destructive assault. Their silence was a declaration of war in and of itself. In the war room of the Galactic Coalition, a jittery insectoid ambassador clicked its mandibles nervously. We've heard nothing from the Russians since we sent the peace accord. Not even a threat or a boast. The silence is unsettling. Another alien, a tall, squid-like creature with a disturbingly expressive face, leaned forward. It must mean they're preparing for something. The Russians are known for their unpredictability. First, they break into our banquet, cause chaos, and now this? They're not going to negotiate. They're coming for blood. Total bloodbath, the insectoid ambassador agreed, shivering slightly. Maybe they're already on the move, suggested a third alien, a broad, armored reptilian creature. Their attack could be imminent. We have to evacuate. It was a reasonable, albeit overly paranoid conclusion. The Russian faction of humanity, as far as they knew, had just coldly ignored their peace offer, obviously a sign that they were readying themselves for total conquest. In a panic, the coalition's leaders ordered the immediate evacuation of several key planets. Over the next few days, entire planetary populations were relocated, industries were abandoned, and strategic defense positions were left completely unmanned. Planets that had been deemed crucial to the war effort were now ghost worlds, with empty cities and military bases sitting in eerie silence. Meanwhile, back on Nova Rus, things were progressing in a way that could only be described as typically Russian. The planet was still recovering from its most recent celebration, the cause of which, like most of their celebrations, had been completely forgotten by the next morning. President Viktor Ivanov was nursing a hangover the size of a small moon when one of his aides burst into his office with surprising urgency. Comrade President, we've just picked up an urgent transmission. Our fleet detected several planets in a nearby system that have been completely abandoned. Ivanov raised an eyebrow, holding his head as if it might fall off. Abandoned? What, did the inhabitants all decide to go on vacation at the same time? The aide scratched his head. We don't know. It's the strangest thing. All the planets we've scanned are fully intact. There's no sign of conflict, but no life forms either. No ships, no defenses, nothing. It's like they just left. Ivanov blinked slowly, trying to make sense of this information through the haze of his headache. So, what are you telling me? Did we win something? The aide hesitated. It's possible. Maybe the aliens heard about our, recent strategic victories and decided to surrender? Ivanov sat up straighter, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Surrender, you say? Ha! They must have heard about how we humiliated them at that fancy banquet. Typical. Russians show up uninvited and the galaxy just can't handle it. The aide wasn't sure whether that was exactly how things had gone down, but he nodded anyway. Yes, Comrade President. It seems the aliens have evacuated entire planets. We've just received word from our scouts. The planets are completely undefended. They left behind factories, weapons, resources, everything. Ivanov's eyes lit up. Well, don't just stand there. Let's send some ships over. If the aliens have decided to leave us some free planets, who are we to refuse? And so, what had initially started as a simple recon mission quickly turned into something much more opportunistic. The Russians deployed a fleet of their most reliable, which is to say, barely operational, ships to the evacuated planets. Their goal? To liberate the abandoned resources. Though, in typical Russian fashion, The true motivation was more about restocking their vodka supplies, which had dwindled after the latest round of festivities. Captain Petrov of the Motherland's Glory led the charge, his ship arriving first in orbit around a deserted planet that had once been home to a highly advanced alien civilization. As the ship descended toward the surface, the crew couldn't believe their eyes. "Is that an entire distillery complex?" one of the officers asked, peering at the scanners. Petrov squinted, his mouth breaking into a grin. "By Lenin's beard, it is. An alien distillery. And they just left it here for us? The fools." The crew erupted into cheers. This was, without a doubt, the greatest victory in Russian history. An entire alien civilization had fled before them, leaving behind a treasure trove of resources. And among those resources, a distillery large enough to keep the entire colony drunk for the next century. Petrov activated the ship's intercom. "Attention, comrades. We've just secured our most valuable asset yet, an entire planet's worth of booze. Commence landing operations and make sure we secure the strategic assets first." The Russians descended on the planet like a swarm of hungry bears, raiding warehouses, factories, and most importantly, the distillery. It didn't take long for them to declare the operation a resounding success. Back at the Galactic Coalition's headquarters, the news of the Russian victories spread like wildfire. The aliens had expected the Russians to launch a brutal assault, but instead, the reports coming in described a swift, silent conquest, whole planets falling without a single shot fired. The Russians were like ghosts, appearing out of nowhere and claiming entire systems before anyone could react. "They've taken 3 planets already," one coalition commander shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "We didn't even see them coming." Another commander, a pale-skinned creature with 4 eyes, nodded grimly. "The Russians are playing a long game. They're not just after territory. They're after our resources. And they're doing it with such efficiency. It's terrifying." The insectoid ambassador clicked nervously. "We should have known. They didn't respond to our peace accord because they never intended to negotiate. They're dismantling us from the inside out." The coalition leaders exchanged anxious glances. No one dared suggest trying to negotiate with the Russians again. Whatever strategy they were employing, it was far too advanced for the coalition to comprehend. The only option now was to keep retreating, keep evacuating, and hope that the Russians' path of destruction would stop before it consumed the entire galaxy. Back on Nova Rus, President Ivanov was lounging on a makeshift throne made out of empty vodka crates, grinning from ear to ear as he listened to the latest reports. "Comrade President," one of his aides said, "we've secured another planet. No resistance, just like the others. We found, more distilleries, and also some weapons, but mostly distilleries." Ivanov chuckled, raising a glass of vodka in triumph. "Another glorious victory for Mother Russia. And to think the galaxy thought they could resist us. Fools, we're unstoppable." As the Russians toasted yet another unearned victory, the rest of the galaxy trembled, convinced that the Russians were the most dangerous force the universe had ever seen. Little did they know, their conquerors were simply drunk and very, very lucky. The aliens were terrified. After the unexpected, devastating conquests by the Russians, they had no choice but to assume the worst. It wasn't just that the Russians had taken several planets without firing a shot. It was how effortlessly they did it. The Galactic Coalition had scrambled their best strategists to analyze the situation, and all of them came to the same conclusion. The Russians were employing some sort of advanced, incomprehensible military strategy, one that involved psychological warfare on a scale never before seen. Now, convinced that the Russians were preparing for another offensive, likely on Earth's own soil, the coalition leaders decided they couldn't wait any longer. It was time to amass a fleet that would not only counter the Russians, but completely annihilate Earth, ensuring that no human would ever be a threat to the galaxy again. A war room deep within the core of the Galactic Coalition's headquarters buzzed with frenetic energy. Dozens of alien species scurried around, their various appendages moving at different speeds as they prepared their plans. "We need enough firepower to obliterate their home planet in a single strike," demanded General Catharl, a hulking reptilian alien with scales the color of molten rock. "If we let them regroup, they'll destroy us all." "They haven't regrouped yet?" muttered an insectoid strategist with a nervous twitch. I thought they already had, psychologically at least. No, Keitharl growled, but we can't wait for them to. The next strike will be on Earth itself. We'll make an example of their entire species. The Coalition's war machine kicked into gear. Factories on half a dozen planets began churning out battleships at an alarming rate. Ships were fitted with enormous weapons, planet-cracking cannons, solar obliterators, gravity bombs, each designed with the sole purpose of ensuring that Earth and everything on it would be reduced to cosmic dust. Back on Earth, in the heart of the Pacific Ocean, a different type of panic was spreading. The humans had intercepted the aliens' communications about the massive fleet buildup, and it was safe to say that the entire planet collectively freaked out. The Earth government, always a bastion of calm in times of intergalactic crisis, was scrambling. "What do you mean they've built a fleet?" demanded General Robinson, pounding his fist on the table of Earth's Defense Council. "How did we not see this coming?" "We've been busy responding to all the weird messages," one of the intelligence officers whined. "You know, congratulating us on victories we didn't even know we had." Robinson rolled his eyes. "Yeah, well, now they're not congratulating us. Now they're going to blow us up. We need to build our own fleet, and we need it now." The room went quiet for a moment, the diplomats and military leaders exchanging uneasy glances. The idea of building an armada was ambitious. Earth hadn't exactly focused on military technology for a while, at least not openly, but then someone cleared their throat from the back of the room. "Why don't we just, use the stuff we've been working on?" The heads of the council turned to the source of the voice. It was Admiral Blake, the representative from the United States, one of the few human nations that still had a significant obsession with oversized, overpowered weapons. Blake grinned and tapped on a holographic display, bringing up an image of a truly absurdly large spacecraft bristling with weapons. Cannons, lasers, something called a singularity grenade launcher. This ship looked like it could vaporize a planet by accident. "We've been working on this baby for a while now. Why not dust it off and give the aliens something to really think about?" Blake grinned, his hand resting casually on the hilt of a ceremonial sword he had clearly brought for dramatic effect. The room went silent. General Robinson squinted at the hologram. What exactly is that?" Admiral Blake's grin widened. "This, my friends, is the USS Overcompensator. And it's not just a ship, it's a statement." Robinson raised an eyebrow. "What kind of statement?" Blake's eyes gleamed. "A statement that says, we'll blow up your entire solar system if you even think about messing with us." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, with an air of resigned panic, Robinson muttered, "All right, build it." The Americans went to work, spearheading the creation of the most over-the-top, unnecessarily destructive fleet the galaxy had ever seen. Ships with planet-destroying cannons, black hole generators, and enough firepower to level entire systems were hastily assembled. As the fleet grew in size, it became clear that the humans were not just preparing to defend Earth. They were preparing to obliterate anything that even looked at Earth sideways. Within weeks, the armada was complete. Massive ships filled the skies above Earth, their shadows casting darkness over entire continents. The fleet was so heavily armed that even Earth's own engineers weren't entirely sure how to safely operate some of the weapons. Admiral Blake stood proudly on the bridge of the USS Overcompensator, admiring the view of Earth's defense fleet. "This," he said, "is how you make a point." But just as the fleet was about to begin their counteroffensive, something unexpected happened. Back on Nova Rus, the Russians were, of course, in the middle of another celebration. President Ivanov was once again holding court in the New Kremlin, a bottle of vodka in one hand and a glass in the other. The mood was jovial, as it always was, for no particular reason at all. "Another toast," Ivanov declared, raising his glass, "to our great victories and the endless supply of vodka provided by the gods of space." The room cheered, clinking glasses and guzzling down their drinks. It was at this moment that one of Ivanov's aides stumbled into the room, his face flushed with excitement. "Comrade President, we've received a message." Ivanov squinted at the aide. "A message? From who?" The aide waved a datapad in the air. "It's a surrender message from the aliens." The room fell silent for a brief moment before erupting into cheers again. Ivanov blinked, processing the information through his vodka-soaked brain. Surrender? To us? Yes, the aide said, barely able to contain his excitement. They're offering unconditional surrender to the Russian people. They're begging for mercy. Ivanov broke into a wide grin, his chest puffing out with pride. Ha! I knew it! They finally realized they couldn't stand against the might of Nova Rus. We are truly the undefeated champions of the galaxy. The room erupted into drunken celebration. Bottles of vodka flying through the air, people dancing on tables, and one man inexplicably lighting a firework inside the building. Meanwhile, the aide handed the datapad to Ivanov, who skimmed the message with a satisfied smirk. He was too drunk to notice that the message was actually meant for Earth. But since it had been written in Russian, and Earth hadn't bothered to decode it, it had been accidentally routed to Nova Rus. Prepare a response, Ivanov bellowed, raising his glass. Let them know that we, the great Russians, accept their surrender, and tell them that vodka shall now be the universal currency of the galaxy. The Russians, in their intoxicated haze, concluded that they had won the war without even needing to engage in another battle. It was perfect. They had become the galaxy's greatest warriors, simply by existing and drinking heavily. Back at the Galactic Coalition's headquarters, the surrender had been sent, and the leaders waited anxiously for a response. They had no idea that their surrender message had gone to the wrong humans entirely. As far as they were concerned, the terrifying armada they had prepared to face was now irrelevant. The humans, they believed, were too powerful, too unpredictable, and far too dangerous to fight. We've done the right thing, one of the coalition commanders said, nodding solemnly. We couldn't risk total annihilation. The rest of the council murmured in agreement, each of them secretly relieved that they wouldn't have to face the human juggernaut. Meanwhile, on Earth, Admiral Blake was pacing back and forth on the bridge of the USS Overcompensator, waiting for orders. His finger hovered dangerously close to the Fire Everything button, but no command to engage had come through yet. Suddenly, a communications officer piped up. Sir, we've just received word from our spies. It seems the Galactic Coalition is dismantling their fleet. They've apparently surrendered. Blake's eyebrows shot up. Surrendered to us? The officer nodded. Yes, sir. Unconditionally. And it seems we accepted. Blake stared at the massive array of planet-destroying weapons surrounding him, a mixture of pride and disappointment washing over him. Well, damn, he muttered, lowering his hand away from the fire button. I didn't even get to blow up one planet. Back in the war room on Earth, General Robinson, receiving the news without context, still let out a long sigh of relief. Well, he said, I guess we scared them off. Good work, everyone. But no one would know for a while that it wasn't Earth's overwhelming firepower that had won the day. It was a vodka-fueled misunderstanding in the far reaches of the galaxy where a group of drunk Russians had accidentally declared themselves the champions of the universe. And the galaxy? The galaxy was too scared to argue. In the heart of the new Kremlin, the Grand Hall was lit up like a space casino on payday. President Viktor Ivanov, head of Nova Rus and self-proclaimed greatest military strategist in the galaxy, in his own mind at least, stood triumphantly at the head of a long banquet table. Bottles of vodka clinked and clattered across the table as his fellow Russians drank themselves into oblivion, toasting victory after victory they hadn't even realized they'd achieved. Comrades, Ivanov bellowed, raising his glass with a wobble that suggested he was one drink away from falling over. We, the mighty Russians of Nova Rus, have done it again. The galaxy bows before us, trembling at the mere mention of our name. We are invincible, unstoppable, and... He paused, struggling to think of a third adjective, but ultimately gave up. Unbelievably good at this. His inebriated audience cheered, half of them not even sure what they were celebrating anymore. The party was in full swing, with music blaring, people dancing on tables, and one particularly enterprising soul trying to invent a new drink that involved setting vodka on fire before consuming it. It wasn't going well. As Ivanov was about to down another glass of vodka, one of his aides stumbled up to him, waving a piece of paper frantically. "Comrade President," the aide slurred, nearly tripping over his own feet. "We've just sent a message to Earth to let them know about, our great victories." Ivanov's eyes lit up, the vodka temporarily giving way to excitement. Ah, perfect. Finally, Earth will recognize us as the supreme human faction. No longer will we be ignored, forgotten. Now they will fear the name of Russia. The aide, still grinning stupidly, nodded. Yes, yes. It was, mostly clear. The FTL comms had a little interference, but I'm sure they got the message. Ivanov waved him off dismissively. Bah! Earthlings are smart. They'll figure it out. They'll see the greatness in every word. Meanwhile, in Earth's central diplomatic hub, things were decidedly less festive. Senior diplomat Laura Winters sat at her desk, rubbing her temples. Ever since the alien surrender fiasco and the construction of Earth's ludicrously oversized fleet, she hadn't had a moment's peace. Diplomacy had devolved into one misunderstanding after another, and now she was staring at yet another message that made absolutely no sense. She squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the garbled transmission that had come through just moments ago. It was filled with random bursts of static, fragmented sentences, and the occasional garbled phrase that looked vaguely threatening. Glory to Russ, supreme hum, victory over all, bow before, unmatched pow, you will know fear. Winters frowned. Is this some kind of alien threat? Her aide, standing beside her, shrugged. Maybe. The comms team said it was garbled pretty badly, but the parts that came through sound, well, ominous. Winters sighed, leaning back in her chair. We don't recognize the sender, do we? Nope. Whoever sent this didn't include any identifiers. But it came through the FTL network, so it's gotta be from someone relatively close. Maybe another alien species? Winters groaned. We just got rid of one galactic crisis. Now some unknown species is declaring war on us? The aide looked nervous. Should we, alert the Defense Council? Winters rubbed her eyes. Yes, and tell them to prep the fleet. If this is a declaration of war, we need to be ready. Back in the Pacific Ocean, on the deck of the USS Overcompensator, Admiral Blake was having the time of his life. He had just received orders to prep the fleet for immediate deployment, and he couldn't have been more excited. All right, boys and girls, he said, pacing in front of the command console. Looks like we've got ourselves a little situation. Some unknown species has decided to mess with Earth. I say we show them exactly what happens when you poke the biggest, baddest bear in the galaxy. His crew cheered, readying the ship's absurd arsenal of planet-destroying weaponry. Blake grinned as the fleet began moving out, the stealth ships already jumping ahead to scout the area. They were heading straight for the origin of the garbled message, the Russian colony of Nova Rus. Back on Nova Rus, the party was in full swing, with vodka flowing freely and the music louder than ever. No one noticed the small fleet of Earth's stealth ships entering the atmosphere, their cloaking devices keeping them hidden as they maneuvered into position. Inside the New Kremlin, Ivanov was on his 7th, or was it 8th, toast of the evening, his face red and his speech starting to slur more than usual. Hit victory! More vodka! He declared, raising his glass once more. Suddenly, a deafening crash shook the building. The roof above them shattered as a sleek black pod smashed through, sending debris flying in all directions. The music cut out, and everyone froze as the pod hissed open, revealing a figure clad in jet black armor, stepping out onto the banquet table like some kind of futuristic Grim Reaper. President Ivanov, in his drunken stupor, stared wide-eyed at the armored figure, his mind racing with one single terrifying thought: assassination. Ah! Ivanov screamed, staggering back from the table, his eyes bulging with fear. His legs gave out beneath him, and in his panic, he lost control of his bladder. The elite human soldier, Sergeant Daniels, stood frozen in place, utterly confused by the scene before him. He had expected an alien warlord, some towering figure of galactic menace, not a middle-aged man in a fur hat who had just soiled himself in front of a crowd of drunk partygoers. Daniels blinked, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. What the hell is going on here? He muttered under his breath, reaching for the translation matrix built into his suit. As soon as the matrix finished its download, a synthesized voice began translating everything around him into Russian. The language, which Daniels had never heard spoken before in his life, filled his earpiece. The translation matrix informed him that these weren't aliens, they were humans. And judging by the looks on their faces, they were just as confused as he was. Ivanov, still lying on the floor in a puddle of his own making, stared up at the armored figure, and in a rare moment of clarity through the fog of vodka, realized that this was not an alien assassin. You're human? Ivanov stammered, pulling himself up into a half-sitting position. Daniels, after a long, awkward pause, nodded. Yes, I'm human. The room let out a collective sigh of relief. One of Ivanov's aides rushed forward, offering the president a towel. Ivanov, now trying to salvage what little dignity he had left, staggered to his feet and grabbed a bottle of vodka from the table. Well, in that case, welcome, comrade, he declared, holding the bottle out toward Daniels. Let us celebrate. Daniels blinked behind his visor. I just need a little water, actually. The translation matrix clicked, and to Ivanov, the request came out as, I just need a little vodka. A broad grin spread across Ivanov's face. Ah, a man after my own heart. Here, take the finest vodka in all of Nova Rus. He shoved the bottle into Daniels' hands. Daniels, completely unaware of the translation mishap, took the bottle, and out of a mixture of politeness and confusion, took a swig. Almost immediately, his eyes widened. The vodka hit him like a freight train. What Daniels didn't know was that his chemical augmentations, designed to enhance combat performance, had an extremely adverse reaction to alcohol. Within seconds, the soldier, built to withstand the rigors of space warfare and hostile alien environments, was utterly incapacitated. Daniels slumped to the floor, the vodka bottle slipping from his fingers. His vision blurred, and he muttered something incoherent as the world around him spun. Ivanov, misinterpreting the situation entirely, burst into laughter. Ha! Ha! See, comrades! Even Earth's finest soldiers can't handle our vodka! The room exploded into cheers, and the celebration continued, louder and rowdier than ever. The Russians were convinced they had once again proven their superiority, while Daniels lay on the floor, completely drunk, trying to remember how his legs worked. As the music blared and the toasts continued, Ivanov raised his glass once more. To victory, he shouted, oblivious to the fact that his victory had been nothing more than a series of misunderstandings, vodka-induced bravado, and a drunk soldier from Earth who just wanted a little water. The lecture hall hummed with a low murmur as the professor paced in front of the gathered students, his eyes gleaming with the delight of someone about to deliver the punchline of a very long, very elaborate joke. And so, he said, pausing for effect, the great Russian colony of Nova Rus, victorious, or so they believed, ended up not just being feared by the Galactic Council, but inspiring a galaxy-wide travel ban to the Orion Arm. He stopped in front of the large, holographic display behind him, which showed a map of the galaxy. The Orion Arm was now marked with several large, flashing warning signs. The students, representing species from all over the galaxy, leaned in, eager for the conclusion to what had been one of the most ridiculous history lessons they'd ever experienced. You see, the professor continued, after their perceived victory and their enthusiastic, if chaotic celebrations, the Russians decided it was time to prepare for future glories by, of course, mining strategic hyperspace lanes. A few of the students exchanged skeptical glances. The professor grinned. Yes, you heard me correctly. They mined hyperspace lanes. Now, I'm sure you can guess how that went. Nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Some of the students were already connecting the dots. The problem, the professor said, waving a hand through the air, as if it would somehow explain everything, was that the man in charge of organizing the entire operation was, predictably, extremely drunk. The chuckles turned into outright laughter. One of the reptilian students in the back snorted. Not only was he drunk, the professor continued, his grin widening, but at some point during the night, right as he was entering the coordinates for the mines, he spilled an entire bottle of vodka directly onto the central computer. More laughter now. A tentacled student raised a hand. Professor, are you telling us that an entire sector of space was rendered dangerous because someone spilled a drink? The professor nodded. Yes, not just any drink, vodka. He paused. To be fair, that specific bottle was probably half the reason they were even able to organize the mining operation in the first place. The class erupted into laughter. But here's the kicker, the professor said, raising his voice above the noise. No one remembers exactly where the mines were placed. They lost the data entirely. The computer was fried. Completely useless. He gestured to the map of the Orion Arm, which now flickered ominously. which means that to this day, no one can safely travel through the Orion Arm without risking, well, total destruction. It's a minefield, literally, and no one has any idea where those mines are. The students' laughter subsided into a mix of amusement and disbelief. One of them, a small creature with multiple eyes, raised a hand. So, Professor, you're telling us that a bunch of drunken Russians basically shut down an entire region of the galaxy? By accident? The professor sighed with mock sadness. Yes, and what's worse? No one's been able to fix it. Every attempt at cleanup has ended in disaster. Ships sent to defuse the mines either can't find them, or when they do find them, accidentally trigger them. Another round of chuckles swept through the room, but it was tinged with nervousness. The thought of such chaos happening on a galactic scale was both absurd and unsettling. Of course, the professor added, straightening up and casting a wry glance at the students, cleanup didn't even begin until after the Dyson Sphere disaster. At this, the room fell silent. The students exchanged curious glances. The professor raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying their confusion. "Oh, you don't know about that?" he asked, feigning surprise. He leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. The Romanian Dyson Sphere disaster? Well, that's a story for another time. Groans of protest rose from the class, but the professor waved them off with a mischievous grin. "That's your homework. Write in the comment section if you want me to make it next week's topic," he teased. Until next time, class dismissed.
Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more original content. New chapters and standalone stories uploaded weekly.